It's a great pleasure to introduce this audience to Jeffry Frieden, who is professor of government and chair of the government department at Harvard. He's an expert in the politics of international monetary and financial relations. His approach, if I may summarize, Jeffrey, is really to tie economics and social science together to understand the future political institutional changes through a deep understanding of the economic forces behind. So this is precisely the type of scholar whom this CHEFES aims to bring together to discuss relevant economic topics for Europe. So I think really we are looking forward to what you tell us. Let me say that Professor Frieden has studied in depth the backlash of globalization and in particular the forces behind Europe disintegration, so like Brexit, populism, etc. So it's not, I mean, I'm really eager to know what has happened to this trend after the pandemic. Is it still global capitalism the way to make everybody better off? I'm sure he has an answer to this or some suggestion. And it would be very interesting to hear what he thinks about the state of health of the European Union. His talk is about populism, polarization, and the pandemic. So without further delay, I leave the virtual floor to Professor Jeffry Frieden, but I want to tell give you some instructions. So he will talk for 45 minutes, about 45 minutes, and then we will allow 15 minutes of question and answer. You find a button to the audience, which is D and R, the domande risposte, which is Q&A. Don't write in the chat, but please, we will unmute you in order for you to make, to be able to answer, to question directly to Professor Frieden. So without any further delay, I leave to you the virtual floor. And welcome.
Thank you very much, Vittoria, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to, it would be a greater pleasure to actually be there, but it's a pleasure to be in the same Zoom environment as you. Let me share my screen and move on from there. What I know that we are largely talking about issues in European integration, and I will say things that I think are relevant to that. But I am also going to give a lot of examples and some evidence from the United States. I think that what is happening in the European Union has many parallels in the United States. There is something of a global nature of the current character of politics in this global capitalist environment in the 21st century. So I do apologize if I haven't given enough attention to the European Union, and I'm happy to try to do that as we get into some of the discussion afterwards. So I think let me start by summarizing some of my main points, since I may not get through all of them. The first is that what we sometimes call the centrist consensus that has reigned since World War II is in the process of collapsing, in my view. And as that happens, there are new poles of political attitudes and policy attitudes forming that we see pretty much in almost all of the advanced industrial economies and in many emerging markets as well. That divide that has been developing over the past 15 or 20 years has economic, has cultural, and now also has geographic, regional characteristics to it. The pandemic, in my view, seems to be playing a role in, to some extent, heightening, hardening, deepening, perhaps, the polarization that has been taking place. At the same time, at least in some contexts, and this gets into a more normative discussion of what might be feasible, what might be possible, I think that the pandemic and its aftermath may have created opportunities to think and perhaps rethink the structure of global capitalism. So let me start with a little bit of background as I try to develop some of these main points. This is the well-known KOF Index of Globalization. I think we are all familiar with the story of an increasing level of economic and political integration since World War II, and especially since the 1970s. And, over the past decade, however, I think it's become clear that the centrist consensus that has reigned since the 1940s is no longer quite so consensual. And just to remind us of how, at least I think about that, the set of policies and politics that emerged from World War II, as encased in some sense in the Bretton Woods agreements, relied heavily on compromise, on a compromise that would include economic integration, both regional economic integration and international economic integration, with a general market orientation on the one hand, but relatively generous social policies on the other. In some sense, to soften the blow of the transition to a more integrated world economy. This is the kind of thing that's often associated in the social scientific literature with the compensation hypothesis. Donny Roderick and others have talked about the fact that countries that open to the world economy tend to develop compensation mechanisms to soften the blow of that opening and of the volatility that ensues. I am reminded of a phrase that's often credited to Keynes in describing what he thought the post-World War II world was going to look like, which is big business, big labor, big government. So that's the way I think about the kind of consensus that ran from center right to center left. Of course, it left out the extreme right, discredited by fascism in World War II, and extreme left, discredited in the context of the Cold War. But from center right to center left, there was this general agreement on a market orientation, economic integration, on political integration, and social policies. There was this developed gradually in the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the 70s, and accelerated rapidly, I think, after about 1980, of course, over the course of the 1980s, especially as first the developing countries, many of which had pursued much more closed economies, and then strikingly the centrally planned economies in the Soviet Union turned towards what we came to call globalization. And the 1990s, I think, were the high point of globalization. The Cold War was over. The West had won, so to speak. Even China and Vietnam had joined the world economy, and democratization was the order of the day in many parts of the world as well. But those of us who follow public opinion, I think, started seeing that attitudes of discontent towards international economic integration and regional integration as well began growing around 2000 or so, and have continued to grow since then. And if a snapshot may not give you a full picture, but if you look at the change over time, I think it is revealing. And the European experience, I think, is particularly revealing. In 1998, to use one metric, populist parties, using a common definition of what counts as populism. No one really knows what it is, but we have a variety of definitions that we use. Populist parties in 1998 got about 10% of the votes in Europe, and they served in two governments. In 2020, populist parties got 24% of the votes in Europe, up from 10%. And we're serving now, not in two governments, but serving in 11 governments. And they were part of a pro-government voting bloc, but not in government in 4 more. More generally, I think if we look around the OECD, party systems and parties are in crisis in almost every developed country. And much of that crisis has to do with the rise of populism, both of the left and of the right. Now, there are massive debates about the sources of the rise of this backlash against globalization, against integration, of this populism. I don't want to get into too many of these debates, but I do want to note that it's pretty clear that there's some association of the rise of populist sentiment with economic distress, with inequality, rising inequality, and then in many cases also with immigration being a catalyst of some of the sentiment that we're talking about here. So that's where we're coming from and where we are in a sense today. And what I want to do now is to describe, I think, what seemed to me to be emerging as two conflicting versions or visions of how to move forward. And Steve Bannon, who, as you may know, was one of the principal advisors to Donald Trump, and is very colorful with his rhetoric. He has been saying for quite some time now, says the 21st century is, or the next period in the 21st century is going to be a period of populism. The only question is whether it's going to be socialist populism or nationalist populism. That's one way of putting it. But more generally, the questions that we face are confronted by and suggest two ways forward, if you will. One path is to continue with economic and political integration as it's been carried out roughly since the 1940s, with reforms, perhaps even very deep reforms. And this would incorporate things including the concern about climate change, concern about multicultural and other characteristics of our industrialized economies, new technological changes, but a general agreement with the notion that economic and political integration is a good thing, that perhaps we have not dealt as well as we might have with some of its consequences, but we should continue to move forward on this front. That's one view. Another view is what Bannon, I think, would call the nationalist populist or populist nationalist path, which is to move away from this pattern of integration, to argue that we have gone too far down this path and that we need to focus more on national treatment of national problems. And I want to just make a point that may well be unnecessary, but I want to point out how significant of a watershed the year 2016 was, especially in the United States. I mean, they're important elsewhere, as Brexit indicates, but in the United States, in 2016, for the first time in 75 years, we had candidates for the nomination of our two principal political parties' presidential candidates for the nomination who were explicitly hostile to international trade, international investment, international finance. Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left. And if we had more time, I could show you parts of the Trump and Sanders stump speeches, which look almost identical in their hostility to international trade, international economic integration more broadly. Of course, one of those two candidates got the nomination of his party, Donald Trump, and then served as president for 4 years. And followed up on much of the kind of nationalist, anti-integrationist, anti-globalist rhetoric that Trump was using during the campaign, with many policies, pulling the US out of the Paris Accord, pulling the US out of the WHO, and pulling the US or taking a much more unilateral view of America's role in the world. So 2016 really was an indication that something dramatic had changed in American politics. And I would argue that Brexit was an indication that something dramatic was changing in European politics as well. So now let me start by trying to lay out what that populist, if you will, or anti-integrationist pole looks like. There are, of course, and I'm going to focus on right-wing populists. There are plenty of left-wing populists out there, and many of them, not all, have a similar attitude towards integration. But I'm going to focus on the right-wing populists because there are more of them, first of all, and their attitude towards integration tends to be more similar and to reflect something strikingly different from where we've been in the past. There are lots of variations among populist movements. There are lots of variations in the motivations of the supporters of populism, but I think that pretty much all of them share a concern, skepticism, even opposition to international forces, whether it's globalization. The US is largely globalization. In Europe, it's largely the European Union. Concern about these international forces overriding national decisions and representing a threat to sovereignty, if you will. The common theme, I think, is perhaps most clearly expressed by the slogan of the Brexiters, which was "Take back control." So you had Donald Trump in the US saying, "We reject the ideology of globalism. We must defend against threat to sovereignty from global governance." Marine Le Pen, "The European Union has become a prison of peoples." Matteo Salvini need a strong country not subordinate to Europe. Viktor Orban defending Hungary's independence and sovereignty and what he calls their illiberal democracy from presumably the European Union. And then elsewhere, Jair Bolsonaro talking about not erasing nationalities and overruling sovereignty in the names of some abstract global interest. So whether it's explicitly targeted at globalization, international trade, the WTO, or at the European Union, or more broadly at global forces, there is this common view that too much has been given away, too much of what countries should be controlling has been given away by national governments, and that control needs to be, again, taken back. So some of this backlash, I think, is due to ideological and cultural factors, especially with regard to immigration, racial and ethnic animosity, their parochialism. All of these contribute to the backlash against the centrist consensus, the backlash against integration. So there clearly are non-economic sources. I think that some is clearly due, in my view, to what I would regard as rational calculation. And this is an approach that I think is underappreciated in the literature. I wish was appreciated more widely, because I think it actually helps explain some of what has been happening. And that is the notion that groups within society or entire countries, in thinking about integration, especially if you're thinking about integration within a regional system like the European Union, but more broadly, joining an international organization like the WTO or the IMF or any of the others, any of the regional or international groupings, there is an expectation of what the policy taken at the supranational level will be. And presumably, countries that join one of these international agglomerations, whether it's something as encompassing as the European Union or something as broad as the WTO, countries join understanding that the expected policies of this supranational entity are not going to be identical to those that would be developed within the country, but that there is a gain to be had, typically scale. So countries join the European Union because they want to take advantage of the greater scale that European integration gives. They understand that many national policies are going to have to come into conformity with European expectations. And so that's going to take the country and the constituents within the country away from their preferences towards the expected policies in the European Union. And so I think we can see in case after case instances in which groups within national political economies or entire countries feel that they are being taken too far away from their ideal point by the supranationally determined policies. So that's just to say that there is a rational way of, I think, one rational spatial way of thinking about circumstances under which people would be skeptical about delegating policies up to the level of the European Union or the WTO or the IMF, and that a rational group, shall we say, would be weighing the extent to which the benefits of scale and cooperation are outweighed by the costs of moving away from their preferred policy. Right? In any event, I think, however, so that's just my pitch for a particular way of thinking about these things. Nonetheless, I do want to emphasize that, yes, there are non-economic sources. Yes, there are these other considerations. But in country after country and case after case, we have found strong evidence that relates populist voting, populist sentiment, whether it's in voting or in the public opinion polls and surveys, with economic distress. And those of you who follow these debates will know that there continue to be debates about what's happening at the individual level, what's happening at the regional level. But at this point, we have, I think, very, very clear evidence that regions that have faced economic distress are regions that have been, if you will, most likely to turn towards populist or anti-integrationist sentiment. So let me talk then a little bit about the geography of the backlash. It's not, and just to make the point that the relationship is more complicated than just people lose a good job or people find their wages being pressed down as individuals and they turn towards populism. We know that politics is a lot more complicated than that. Politics is affected by the environment that you're in, by the social attitudes of the people that you're around. And one way of seeing that, I think, is that when we look at the centers of populist sentiment, whether in the US or in Europe, they tend to be quite clearly delineated on a regional basis. When we look at voting for the National Front or National Assembly in France, it's concentrated in the declining industrial regions of the north of France and then the south of France. The Brexit vote concentrated again in the declining industrial regions of the Midlands of England. There's Eastern Germany. And in the United States, we know that the declining manufacturing areas have been at the forefront of the upsurge in some of this populist sentiment. In many cases, one of the reasons these regions are so striking politically is that it's not that they've just done badly since the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. It's that in many cases, they have been declining for decades. In the case of the former manufacturing regions or the manufacturing regions in the Midwest United States, many of them have been declining since the early 1970s. And that decline has been, I think, has contributed to a sense that these declining regions have been left behind by that centrist consensus by policymakers in the major industrial economies, that compensation has in fact not been given to those who have been the losers from globalization and technological change, and that the concerns of those who have been left behind, if you will, have not been adequately represented in the political arena, that the prosperous regions of our countries are well represented, reflected in the media, in political discussions by politicians, but the areas that have been lagging farther and farther behind, in some cases in a downward spiral, have not been well represented in national politics. So that leads to some fairly striking regional divisions in most of our countries. So let me give you the example of the United States. I'm going to give you a bunch of American examples, but I think you could probably draw some similar geographical and regional examples in the European context as well. This is what is probably well known to you by now, a map of the states' vote in the 2020 election. This is the 2020 election, not the 2016 election. And you can see that the prosperous Northeast and the prosperous West Coast were very solidly Democratic. And then within it, so if we were to describe what this kind of regional breakdown that I've been talking about looks like in the US, we have a prosperous East Coast, we have a prosperous West Coast, prosperous Northeast rather, prosperous West Coast, and then islands of prosperous big cities in between, right? And what we see here is much of that area in between voting solidly Republican. Can do it a little bit more differentiated. This is a county by county map. And again, you can see the Northeast coast, the big prosperous cities from Boston to New York, to Philadelphia, to Washington, all doing quite well. And prosperous big cities in between, like Chicago and Minneapolis and Atlanta, and then the prosperous coastal areas of the West. And one thing about this particular map is because it's county by county, it doesn't take into account the fact that the population is not evenly distributed among counties. There are many counties that have very, very few people. So this is a map that actually controls for population, or corrects for population. So it gives you the size of the population of the county as well as its vote. And again, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., solidly blue in the Northeast. Miami, even in the South, we see solidly blue Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Chicago, Minneapolis, Denver, and the big cities of the West. And then all throughout the ex-urban areas, the small towns and cities of the former industrial regions, the rural areas, all voting more and more heavily Republican, right, in the 2020 election. So that's sort of how things have developed over the past 15 or 20 years, that globalization has given rise to many benefits, of course, but has also caused lots of pain, hurt, and hardship in regions of our countries. There are many people in those regions that feel that governments have not adequately addressed their concerns, not adequately met their needs. And that has, I think, been one of the principal sources of this backlash against, I would call it backlash against integration, not just against globalization. In Europe, it's not really against globalization, it's against European integration, this backlash against integration, and this backlash against what we might think of as being the mainstream of that centrist consensus in the post-World War II era. Well, along comes the pandemic. And the pandemic is, of course, unprecedented in 100 years and shakes up certainly the social organization and the politics in many cases in our countries. There are very different national experiences, and I'm certainly not going to try to survey all of them. One thing to point out, it seems perhaps cruel and maybe overly simplistic to mention this, but one of the big differences among the national experiences is that some were competent and some were incompetent. That is, very strikingly, some countries were able to address the challenge of the pandemic relatively successfully. And there lots of work being done on what explains better and worse responses to the pandemic. We have, even in the United States, we have more and less competent responses among various states. I will say one thing, and I feel I can't help but point it out, but there is clearly, in my view, a relationship between the extent of support for these kind of populist policies that I've been talking about on the one hand, and an incompetent or at least sorely lacking response to the pandemic. And I'm not quite sure where that comes from. In the American context, and I think in some others as well, I think is of a piece with the notion that the existing political institutions, existing political parties, existing experts can't be trusted. And since existing experts can't be trusted, we're not going to take the advice that they're giving us about how to confront the pandemic. And that might be a justifiable view if you're talking about social policies or something like that. It's probably not a very good view if you're talking about less political issues like how to confront a global pandemic. In any event, in instances in which there was incompetence associated with populism, in many instances that exacerbated the extent of polarization. So we often say, in talking about what happens when you have the rise of populist or more extreme movements, is that if the policies that they propose don't work, they don't typically move away from those policies. They typically double down on them. And we saw that in many instances during the pandemic, in cases where they weren't voted out of office. In any event, I want to talk a little bit about what I see forming as the implications of the pandemic. Now, it may be premature to start talking about the implications of the pandemic. We in the United States and you in Europe are relatively lucky in our access to vaccine and our growing access to vaccine, but we should, of course, remember that in much of the world, especially in the developing world, the pandemic is still raging and vaccines are rare, if not unavailable. But we can look at what's happened and what is happening in the OECD to think about some of the implications of what the developed world, the industrial world, North America, Europe, Japan, is likely to look like as we come out of the depths of the pandemic. And I think what it looks like, what I see as I look around, and this is really, we're only a few months in, I think, into what we can talk about the aftermath of the pandemic, but what I see it really is a sort of a hardening of positions. That is, those who believe that the way forward needs to involve more multilateralism, more global cooperation, maybe plenty of reforms, things along those lines, but continuing on the path of global multilateral cooperation, that they look at the fact that there was some quite significant cooperation to provide these global public goods in public health. After all, global public health is one of the examples we usually give, or at least I usually give my students, of a global public good, because after all, the microbes don't know where the borders are, and it doesn't make any sense at all to stamp out smallpox, let's say, in your country, if the countries surrounding you have not stamped it out. So there are strong arguments for cooperation, the provision of global public health and public goods and global public health. And so people have taken away, I think, some lessons and some belief that the pandemic is an argument for continuing this level of cooperation. And then on another dimension, as I'm sure you all know, the pandemic has been confronted in virtually every industrial country with massive fiscal programs to try to counter the inevitable economic effects of the fear that the pandemic has given rise to, and the measures that were taken to try to address the pandemic, the non-pharmaceutical measures, interventions taken to address the pandemic. Just to give you some data, I mean, this is the fiscal response within the OECD and a few other countries. And you can see the blue line includes loan guarantees. I mean, so in the case of Germany and Italy, for example, the loan guarantees bring spending, and this is from January of 2020 to March of 2021, to 35% of GDP, which is just extraordinary. But if we take more broadly the OECD, this is the advanced economies as a whole, we see that just the additional spending and foregone revenue is about 9% of GDP. These are massive, massive numbers, and they have been almost across the board applied within the advanced industrial economies, much less so in the developing world, which has less fiscal space. But these fiscal programs have been obviously one of the most striking characteristics of the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. And the U.S. in some ways, I think, is taking the lead in this, in that these fiscal programs often in the United States, they certainly under the new Biden administration in particular, are taking on very strong social policy and, for that matter, also environmental policy components. So on the one hand, we see, and again, I think the U.S. may be the poster child for this, we see a rekindling of a belief in international cooperation and massive push to deal with some of the social, environmental, and other policies in the context of coming out of the pandemic. On the other hand, it is clear that there remain very substantial nationalist reactions that in many countries around the world, in many regions of our countries, the response to the pandemic has not been to an increased level of trust in government or belief in the ability of government to confront our problems, but in fact, perhaps a growth in skepticism about what governments say, what experts say, a belief that that the governments have been misleading us, that governments are not telling us the whole truth, especially where, as I say, passions have already been inflamed. There is both, in many instances, a distrust of government and growing distrust of government, and the resentment of government policies to deal with the pandemic, hostility towards the non-pharmaceutical interventions, that is the shutdowns, lockdowns that were put in place during the pandemic, belief that this was overstretched by by big government, and generally, as I was saying before, sort of a doubling down on the anti-government or anti-consensus view that had prevailed. And I'll give you some examples from the US. It sometimes takes fairly bizarre manifestations in its divisions in the population, and I have to admit that there is something strange about what has been going on in the US along these lines. But if you look at the US, this is through last week actually, and this is the green, the shade of green shows the proportion of the population that has been vaccinated with at least one dose of our various vaccines. And again, you can see the Northeast, then the Upper Midwest, the West Coast. That division of the map may look familiar to you. And if I had more time and better technological skills, I could overlay this more fully. But let me just remind you of what the state by state vote for the presidency looks like and how similar it is to this vaccination map. So you can perhaps do some of the correlation in your mind. It has turned out to be a highly politicized process of vaccination, where Republican states that went for Donald Trump in 2020 have much lower rates of vaccination than Democratic states that went for Joe Biden. You don't have to do that correlation in your mind because I've got it here. The states in blue are states that went for Biden. The size of the bubble is the size of the population of the state. States in red, of course, went for Trump. And what you can see here is that the top 22 states with the highest adult vaccination rates all went to Joe Biden, the Democrat, in the last election. And 17 of the 18 states with the lowest adult vaccination rates went to Donald Trump. And this is a big range. It goes from a vaccination rate of 44% in Mississippi to 83% in Vermont. So this division is taking many forms. I think this is one of the most bizarre, but it does, I think, speak to the fact that there are non-economic, cultural, and other factors at work here. Okay, in this context, how do we think about the way forward? I think, in my view, we are at a fork in the road. That the advanced industrial countries are faced with some serious questions about how they are going to move forward in this new economic and political and social environment. I do not think that we are going to be able to return to the status quo ante, to simply continue the past patterns of economic, political, and social policies. I think that we have seen that the centrist consensus, as it was playing out in the 2000s and the 2010s, proved unable to address the concerns of many of our citizens. And maybe I haven't emphasized enough, I would like to emphasize some, that I think that the concerns that many of our citizens have about not being appropriately attended to by the political system, by political parties, by political leaders, that these concerns are legitimate. It is not imaginary that the US has become more and more unequal. People are not imagining things when they talk about the fact that in small cities and towns all over the industrial regions of the Midwest, there are generations who have lost hope, where social mobility has retreated in the United States, where generation after generation finds itself in very difficult economic and social conditions, and government has not been doing enough to deal with those conditions. So I think that we have learned, maybe the hard way, but we have learned that there are important and legitimate concerns of many of our citizens that we have not addressed up until now, or not addressed adequately. And one lesson that I would draw from that in thinking about this particular way forward is that if we want to sustain economic and political integration, and I'm of the view that on balance they are good things. If we want to sustain them, we need to attend much more fully and much more adequately attend to the socioeconomic sources of the backlash. Those of us who believe that the best path forward involves some measure of integration, globalization, have to recognize the reality, which is that up to now, the policies of the past have not really met the needs of entire groups of our populations, of entire regions of our countries. And that is not tenable, and has not proved to be tenable now, and will not be tenable in the future. But I do think that there may be some hope, because the pandemic may provide some opportunities. Both economic and political conditions may be more favorable. There is, looking at the fiscal policy, there is, I think, substantially more fiscal space than there has been in the past. Partly, some of that is simply macroeconomic. With historically low interest rates, it's a lot easier for governments to borrow to carry out generous and ambitious social programs. But I think there is more than that. more than just the macroeconomic fiscal space, there is some increasing consensus around the fact that our infrastructures have been neglected. And by infrastructure, I mean not just the economic infrastructure of bridges and harbors, but also the social infrastructure of our educational systems, of our ability to integrate new generations into technologically changing environments. So I think there is agreement, and even in the United States, as divided as we are, some consensus about the need for spending on economic and social infrastructure. There's another angle to this as well, which is that as the competition, if you will, between China and the US, China and other parts of the world becomes more significant, that gives something of a national security rationale. And I want to be too opportunistic about this, but I might remind you that back in the 1940s, when most Americans were still pretty isolationist and not convinced on the desirability of free trade and economic integration, the way American public opinion was swung in favor of things like the Bretton Woods agreements and the Marshall Plan and GATT and trade liberalization was on national security grounds. This was the way to build a bulwark of Western societies against the Soviet Union. So there, again, I'm not recommending this because I think there's some opportunism involved, but I think that from a political standpoint, both within countries and across countries, the fact that there are some real challenges that we face from China as a non-market society and an undemocratic society that may contribute to the sense that, yes, we do need to work together as Western or more generally advanced democracies to deal with the challenge that China as a competitor poses. So I think that there are opportunities. I think also, however, that time may be limited. This window may close soon. We see that the general sentiments that have underwritten a lot of the populist feeling have not gone away. I would say from the standpoint of the United States that the Biden administration, the Democrats, need to show that they actually do have a better way forward if they're going to be able to defeat the forces that have been underlying the backlash against globalization in the U.S. So I think time is limited, and at this last slide, in a sense, is me as a citizen with particular preferences thinking about what we need to do to try to sustain the level of economic and political integration that I at least would prefer. But I can step back a little bit and say, whatever your normative views are, as scholars, I think there are lots and lots of really important things that we need to focus on. We need to understand the sources of the backlash. We've been doing a lot of work on that. Many of you have been involved in that, I know. We need to understand better than we do now what the impact of measures to address some of these failures look like. That is, does compensation work? There's pretty good evidence that compensation works, but how well does it work? Are there different forms of compensation or social policies that are better or worse, more effective or less effective, better at increasing the social mobility of future generations? And then think about what possible sources there are of cooperation and conflict among countries as we move forward. So there's a lot of important academic research to be done. A lot of that academic research, I think, may be illuminating for those who find themselves to be in policy-making circumstances. I think that we are in an extraordinarily interesting time in the international political economy and in the history of global capitalism. I am guardedly optimistic about the future, but it is going to be, there's going to be lots of conflict. There is going to be lots of struggle, and of course, lots of things to try to understand and to study as scholars. So I will stop there, and we can open it up to discussion.